Right, thank you. And Thomas is quite right. There is considerable overlap, which will enable me, I hope, to get through this in 20 minutes. The slides are all text, no pretty pictures. And if I just point out that at the moment I'm locked out of that email account, I'll sort it out when I get back to the UK. So if anybody wants a copy of the slides, which are considerably more detailed than anything I'll say, give me your email address and I'll send them as soon as I'm back in the UK. Right, so my title up on the screen there, and I'll launch into it. The power struggle that took place over about 16 months between the Battle of Ascalon and Easter 1101 was on the surface between the secular and ecclesiastical powers in the nascent Kingdom of Jerusalem, but at its heart were two clerics, Arnulf of Schoch and Dibert of Pisa. To trace its development, we find ourselves deprived of the comparative wealth of participants' evidence for events of the First Crusade, and dependent on two main histories, those of Albert of Aachen, now that should bring up the next, thank you, Albert of Aachen and Fulcher of Chartres. We're not going to be using the Fulcher's history as in Hagenmeyer's 1913 edition. I propose instead a conjectural reconstruction of the version of 1106 that Fulcher dispatched to Northern Europe. This came to the notice of the anonymous guest author of the Gesta Francorum Jerusalem Expugnantium, which I'm now going to call the GFIE for speed, and Guibert of Nogent. The reconstruction is supported by a manuscript in the Cambridge University Library. It is as yet unedited, although the Recueil editors printed the most important variants as long footnotes to their edition. Hagenmeyer, and this is important, he dismissed the manuscript as a hybrid reworking of Fulcher's history and the GFIE, in the belief that the three writers were working alongside each other in Jerusalem. Quite a cosy picture, really. So far as the GFIE is concerned, Tom Smith and I have established in our forthcoming edition, it's due out next April, that it was composed and circulated in Flanders, and I aim to demonstrate that the Cambridge manuscript actually preserves a later copy of Fulcher's working draft as it was before his major revision of 1124. Right, this is the Dramatis Personae. We've already met them, I think, Godfrey, etc. The seeds of the conflict and the confrontational alignment of Arnulf and Dibert started at Christmas 1099. Godfrey had been made ruler of the kingdom the previous July, and Arnulf had been appointed to the provisional charge of church affairs. The GFIE calls him quasi-patriarch, while Albert of Aachen explains at some length that the appointment of a patriarch of Jerusalem was delayed until there was a worthy candidate. But meanwhile, they appointed Arnulf Schoch, Chancellor of the Holy Church of Jerusalem, Procurator of the Holy Relics, and Keepers of the Arms of the Faithful. The Cambridge manuscript and 1120's Fulcher agree that the election of a patriarch was deferred, but without mention of Arnulf, so it is possible that a GFIE writer incorporated local knowledge into his narrative. We should, however, note that Raymond of Aguier, a Provençal and close to Raymond of Toulouse, was present and involved in the dispute, and he states that Arnulf was elected by some and duly appropriated the patriarchate, although he was completely unsuited to it. Fulcher, writing after both Baldwin I and Arnulf were dead, did not mention Arnulf at all, writing only that, sorry, that's important, no, that the canons were created for the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. Arnulf had been with the crusading armies from the beginning, and was well known, if not universally well liked. Archbishop Dibert of Pisa arrived in Syria after the capture of Jerusalem and was an unknown quantity. He was a supporter of the Reformed papacy. You've heard most of this already. However, by the time he arrived in Jerusalem, Pope Urban, who had appointed him legate, his death had cancelled his legatine authority. Presumably, somewhat at a loss, he joined Bohemond of Antioch in attacking the port of Latakia. And I should mention that was actually in Christian hands at the time, so it was an odd thing to do. He and his Pisans were still in northern Syria when Bohemond and Baldwin of Edessa passed through on the way to Jerusalem to complete their pilgrimage. So Dibert travelled with them. This was the first time Fulcher of Chartres had seen Jerusalem, and his later redactions preserved almost all of the impressions of the journey and the city that he recorded soon afterwards. The pilgrims were welcomed into Jerusalem on 21st of December 1099, visited the holy places, and then celebrated Christmas in Bethlehem. Back in Jerusalem, Dibert was appointed patriarch. In the 1120s, Fulcher made only the briefest mention of this. The GFIE, Bartolf, as Professor Rousseau called him, called the author, I should say, made a fuller account, and you've seen this already in red, this very important point, which I have actually written up in more than one place, that it was the sea power that came with Dibert that was much more important than his spiritual credentials, if we can call them that. Where was that? Yes, I won't read it in full. I mean, you can see it, and as I say, you can look it up when you get your edition next April. The pragmatic reason for Dibert's appointment is convincing. Godfrey had tried to capture Arsuf already, but failed for lack of naval support. The later reliance of King Baldwin on the Pisan and Genoese fleets to capture Arsuf and Caesarea in 1101 and Acre in 1104 is confirmed by Albert of Aachen. It is highly probable that the GFIE recorded the Pisan connection from his 1106 source, and that Fulcher later omitted it when it had become a political embarrassment. We should also note Arnulf's acquiescence to Dibert's appointment. Arnulf's protégé, Ralph of Caen, claimed that this was because he was a man of great generosity who hoped that Dibert would be more successful in spreading Christianity than he might be. It is much more likely that the worldly Arnulf understood the strategic reasons for Dibert's appointment and, as I shall argue, recognized the possibilities of the Holy Sepulchre post. Thank you. Less than a year later, Fulcher was back in Jerusalem. Duke Godfrey had died barely a year after the capture of Jerusalem, and a small deputation of loyal supporters travelled to Edessa to inform his brother Baldwin that the kingdom was his by hereditary right, which we haven't got time to go into. Meanwhile, though, back in the city of Jerusalem, Patriarch Dibert, in alliance with Bohemond of Antioch and Bohemond's nephew Tancred of Galilee, opposed Baldwin's succession. In this faction, the secular princes had their personal and secular ambitions. For example, Tancred was challenging the loyalist Geldemar Carpanel for the lordship of Haifa, while the Patriarch had been trying to erode Godfrey's authority in the kingdom since his appointment. Whether Dibert genuinely believed that the kingdom should be an ecclesiastical state, or whether he was motivated by personal ambition and greed, has long been disputed. The details of the Patriarch's plot have been set out fully by Alan Murray, and I won't rehearse them here. It's in that obscure book, I think, the 2000 volume. No, it's in the previous one, sorry. Baldwin settled his affairs in Edessa before marching south along the coast road to claim his kingdom. He was accompanied by Fulcher of Chartres, who recorded his experience of the journey at length and with vivid detail. Close comparison of the accounts in Hagenmeyer's edition and the Cambridge manuscript reveals numerous verbal differences with occasional added phrases, some omissions and summarizing in the later redaction, but there is nothing in my estimation that rules out the manuscripts having preserved Pulcher's original eyewitness account. On the contrary, both use the phrase ego Pulcher conotensis. Tellingly, the manuscript describes bypassing Caesarea and Arsul, that is Azotus, before they came to Jaffa. By the time he revised his Historia, Pulcher knew that Azotus was about 34 kilometres south of Jaffa, and he corrected his writing. The manuscript also has the most exuberant account of the welcome that Baldwin received in Jerusalem, calling him the man who had already been chosen to be king of the city and the realm. Pulcher's revision is more restrained and omits Baldwin's recognition as pre-elected king. Meanwhile, Patriarch Dibert was sulking on Mount Zion. There's an interesting progression in the explanation for this between our three sources. In the manuscript, the onus is firmly on Baldwin. Patriarch Dibert was not amongst them because Baldwin was ill-disposed towards him, and the greater part of the clergy and the people of the city hated him. For this reason he was staying on Mount Zion until Baldwin forgave him the offence of malevolence. In the 1120s, Pulcher impersonalized his earlier entry. You can read this in the usual places. The early version was also toned down in the GFIE, which simply says, because the Saviour's nativity was at hand, and because Baldwin and Patriarch Dibert were somewhat at odds with each other on account of certain suspicions and mutterings of the people, Baldwin's coronation and enthronement as king were delayed to the feast day. It was, in fact, still only November, so the writer was rationalizing a few weeks' delay before Baldwin's coronation. Choosing to be crowned at Christmas and in Bethlehem was entirely explicable without any regard for the need to win over the patriarch. Notably, there was no reason for Baldwin to insist on being crowned at once. After a few days of rest, the king was confident enough to leave Jerusalem and embark on an expedition which took him to the Dead Sea and across the River Jordan. He arrived back in Jerusalem on 21st of December, by which time the regalia had been prepared for his coronation, as no doubt he had instructed before he left. Albert of Aachen presents the decision to crown Baldwin on Christmas Day as a result of a consultation with the patriarch and the nobles after Baldwin's return from Transjordan, but this is not credible, as it would have allowed only 3 days for the preparations to be made. An obvious reason for the choice of day was that it was already a day of celebration, but even more cogently, the Lotharingian brothers claimed descent from Charlemagne, who was crowned on Christmas Day in 800, exactly 300 years before. 200 years later, Stephen, the first Christian king of Hungary, was crowned on the same date. William I of England chose to be crowned on Christmas Day 1066, and here in Gniezno, successive kings were crowned at Christmas in 1024, 1025 and 1076. It was the obvious choice of date, and Bethlehem the logical place. Furthermore, coronation in Bethlehem avoided provoking the clergy. Quoting Albert again, Baldwin was unwilling to be exalted and wear a diadem of gold and to be made king in Jerusalem, where Lord Jesus, King of Kings, was brought low and subject even to death for the redemption of the world, and was crowned with terrible and sharp thorns. This echoed the grounds on which Raymond of Toulouse refused the crown of Jerusalem in July 1099, as well as Duke Godfrey's preference not to bear the title of king. In addition, Bethlehem was where the prophet Samuel anointed David as king of Israel. By choosing to be consecrated there, Baldwin was tacitly positioning himself as successor to the kings of the Old Testament. In brief, we should reject Fulcher's implication that Dibert had to be persuaded to crown the king. More likely, the patriarch came to realize that the ceremony was going to take place with or without him, for the majority of clergy and laity wanted it to happen. There is a strong indication of this in the Cambridge manuscript, where Patriarch Dibert, this is quotation, was reconciled with King Baldwin and the canons, but not everyone was restored to peace with that same Dibert. Portia later changed this to Dibert was restored to peace with Lord Baldwin and with some of the canons of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, because sensible men had managed this and their quarrel ceased. He kept little detail of the ceremony in his 1120s edit, omitting the key information that the manuscript preserves, that Baldwin was reverently raised to the kingship by holy unction and crowned. That's in the manuscript. The GFIE omits Portia's elaborate justification for Baldwin's being crowned, while his brother Godfrey was not, which we did actually see in Professor Russo's presentation. So now we come to the showdown. Yes, not very long. King Baldwin then turned his attention to consolidating and expanding his kingdom. This included upholding the claim of his supporter Geldemar Carpinel to Haifa, which was contested by Baldwin's enemy Tancred. An uneasy agreement was reached only when Tancred was summoned to rule Antioch while Bohemond was in captivity. Bohemond's kidnapped by the Danish Mendids thus removed Baldwin's two chief lay opponents. Patriarch Dibert remained still unpopular among the clergy and sowing dissension. I invite you to read Albert of Aachen's accusations of embezzlement and venality, as well as treachery, not because they were necessarily true, but because this was how people in Baldwin's circle were thinking at the time. Albert alone reports that a church council was called to hear charges of treachery against Dibert, and since Dibert then became even more hostile, the case was appealed to Rome. Pope Pascal sent a cardinal, we saw Morris on screen a while ago, to judge him on the case, and Dibert was suspended from office, which did not allow him to participate in the events leading up to Easter 1101. He pleaded with the king and then secretly offered him a massive bribe, which regrettably Baldwin accepted. He needed it for his troops. He was desperate to pay his army. But secondly, he was very possibly aware of a scheme for Dibert's public humiliation, for which Dibert needed to be presiding over the Easter celebration. And so we come to the Holy Fire ceremony. On Holy Saturday, in fact, I think Luigi said it was the Friday, it's actually the day before Easter Day, crowds of Christians gathered in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem to witness the phenomenon of the Holy Fire, which was believed miraculously to kindle flames in the lamps of the edicule that houses the tomb of Christ. In 1101, the fire didn't arrive as expected. Writing in the mid-1120s, Fulcher of Chartres merely observed that after the Easter ceremony had been carried out, when everyone was perturbed because we didn't have the fire on Holy Saturday at the Lord's Sepulchre, the king set out for Jaffa. The brevity of Fulcher's statement is extraordinary, but partly because we know from other sources that there was great consternation and alarm among Christians in Jerusalem, but chiefly because Fulcher's own long and vivid eyewitness account of the event survives in earlier redactions of his Historia, including the Cambridge manuscript and in the version used for the GFIE and by Guibert. If we remember that a feature of the GFIE's writing method is his scrupulous conversion of Fulcher's first-person narrative to third-person pronouns and verbs, and also that he tended to omit passages where Fulcher described his own reactions and emotions. The two versions are directly comparable. The manuscript uses about 1,400 words and the GFIE about 1200. It's difficult to exaggerate the vivid immediacy conveyed by the first-person narrative that is transmitted in the manuscript. There can be no reasonable doubt that Fulcher was in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre on the day, is that slide 10? I can't remember. I think you might have missed one there. Yeah. So he was in the church on Holy Saturday, 1101, hoping to witness the Holy Fire miracle. And I put up some of his reaction there, but he recording the strangeness of the Greek chant of Kyrie eleison, he wrote, I, Fulcher, moreover, who had never heard this sort of harmonious sound, and many others who were new to this praiseful noise, raised our gaze on high, and inspired by compunction in our hearts, we got up from the ground and hoped that the nourishing light was already lit somewhere or other in the church. Is that there? I presumably shouldn't go through that because we're a bit short of time. He also wrote, the GFIE author distanced himself from the subjectivity of his source. He also wrote more concisely, observing characteristically towards the end, and so that I don't get mired in the details. However, there seem to have been some particulars in the 1106 account that were later suppressed by Fulcher. They are important because they pertain to the role of the Latin patriarch. Firstly, Divert is named in the GFIE but not in the manuscript. In the GFIE, Divert delivered a long sermon towards sunset on the Saturday, following which he had confessed in the presence of all. Have I put that on screen? He confessed in the presence of all that he was guilty and very much at fault. He attested that he had been implicated in many crimes from his first youth. He intoned with a doleful face and voice that, driven by his own faults, he had given offence to God, and therefore God was postponing it or completely refusing to send that grace which he was accustomed to send from heaven to earth for the consolation of his people. Patriarch laid aside his staff and completely abdicated his pastoral responsibility. He threw himself down, prone before the altar, stretched out his hands and poured forth copious tears. In the Cambridge manuscript, the patriarch's self-abasement, I'm nearly finished, was on the Saturday evening, and it was not a confession of personal guilt and responsibility for the disaster of the failure of the miracle. My conjecture is that Fulcher's first record of events, as used by the GFIE author, named and condemned Divert, who was disgraced at the time, but it was revised later after both Baldwin I and Arnulf of Schauk died in 1118. The decision to excise the whole event came during Fulcher's 1124 revision. A very important point made by both writers and Guibert of Nogent is that after the miracle occurred, King Baldwin appeared in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre wearing all the trappings of royalty, including the crown. Now, who was in charge of the canons of the Holy Sepulchre? Obviously, it was not the Patriarch, but the Archdeacon, Arnulf of Schauk. He was in a position to stage manage proceedings, probably in collusion with the Eastern clergy, whose long-standing Easter ceremony had been hijacked by Patriarch Divert. It was probably none of their doing, however, that the culmination of an emotional Easter day was the appearance of King Baldwin in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, wearing full regalia and the crown of Jerusalem. This marked Baldwin's victory in the power struggle with Divert. As a sum-up slide. And I'd better finish, hadn't I? Yes. Possible reasons why Fulcher later admitted it. The miracle persists, so that's a modern picture of the fire taking place. But, as I say, we don't need to discuss that. You all right with that?